Well, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Welcome, Sean, and welcome, Owen. We have a fantastic webinar planned for this evening. And I'll just introduce ourselves. My name's Dr. Lyrebird Health. I'm the clinical director at Lyrebird, as well as a practicing gastroenterologist at Mount Monash Health and senior lecturer at Monash University. I think we've got a really interesting and hopefully stimulating discussion planned for tonight about the use of AI documentation in general practice, focusing on privacy, consent, and clinical risk. Now, with us tonight, we have two really special guests, and that is Dr. Owen Bradfield and Dr. Sean Stevens. I will do a quick bio for both of them to avoid them having to do it themselves. So Dr. Owen Bradfield is a dual qualified medical practitioner and health lawyer. He's currently the Chief Medical Officer and medico-legal lead at the Medical Indemnity Protection Society. He has 15 years experience in the medical indemnity insurance industry and has advised and represented many doctors on a range of medical legal disputes, including civil claims, regulatory complaints, employment disputes, coronial inquests, and Medicare investigations. Owen is also a health law researcher at the Law and Public Health Unit at Melbourne University, and also a Fulbright scholar and a member of the Australian Government Telehealth and Virtual Care Expert Advisory Group. I can't think of anyone else that we would rather have on a discussion around clinical risk. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Bradfield.
Thanks very much, Ray. Good to be here.
Fantastic. And we also have with us Dr. Sean Stevens, who's a GP and medical leader and digital health advocate with extensive experience in clinical practice. Anyone who's been a GP in the digital health space will know of Dr. Stevens. He's also got a really interesting governance and healthcare innovation and is a fellow of the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, currently serving as the RACGP Council member, having previously held roles as a board director and chair of the RACGP WA faculty. He's also the owner and director of Grove Medical Victoria Park and Grove Medical Cockburn in Western Australia, and is a graduate of the AICD. And he really does bring significant governance experience from his time on the board at RACGP, where he contributed to the strategic direction of more than 43,000 members. Beyond his clinical and leadership roles, Dr. Stevens is a founder and the host of The Good GP, I'm sure a podcast well known to many of you, Australia's leading general practice podcast, and has produced over 200 episodes. Congratulations on that, Dr. Stevens, and reached more than 1 million downloads. That is an amazing achievement. So welcome, Sean.
Thanks for having me, Ray.
Fantastic. So really tonight we are looking at the issue of AI documentation tools, and we know that these are emerging in general practice largely because the documentation burden has just become unsustainable. We know that this is the case in many areas, but we know particularly in general practice that's the case where over the last decade, the amount of time clinicians spend documenting consultations has really steadily increased. And this is driven by regulatory requirements, billing complexity, the need to capture detailed information, of course, in the EMR. So for many GPs, this means that a significant proportion of a consultation is spent typing or clicking, and I don't need to tell this audience here, rather than engaging with the patient. So really these tools are an attempt to rebalance that dynamic, listening to the consultation, generating a structured note automatically, and then allowing the general practitioner to review that. The goal is not really, I think, simply efficiency, but it also allows the general practitioner to engage with their patients more meaningfully. So because these tools are becoming more common though, I think there's questions clinicians are asking that are quite important and sensible. First, around the accuracy and reliability and who's actually responsible for the note. Then there's issues around where the data is going and how it's processed. And of course, there's a really important questions around what happens if the AI note generates an error, where's the responsibility ultimately lie? And I think some of these questions are things that we really want to address this evening, sorry. There's sort of privacy, consent, medico-legal clarity, which I think our guests will bring some clarity to in this conversation. So look, I thought we'd just start this evening by asking a couple of quick questions to the audience. And so there is a question that should be coming up on the screen. So let me just see if I can find that.
Just while
So,
you're looking for the poll question, Ray, just a couple of comments have come through already, just asking if you could speak a little bit more loudly, or not sure if into the microphone. Just not sure if you saw those comments. You might not because you were speaking,
I
but
did, but thank you very much for that.
sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you very much for that. Let me just see if I can fix that for a second. Right, that should be better, I think. How's that? Is that any better, Owen?
Perfect.
Heaps
That's
better.
great.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So we're going to bring up the audience Q&A, and so the first questions are really around about the use of AI documentation in your clinical workflows. So if we can bring that up for a second and see whether that is, I'll just see if I can bring that up there. Yeah, so that should be up on the screen now. So are you using it? Maybe you've tried it a little bit, or maybe you've given it a good go. Let's see what that comes up with. While we're doing that, we will be going through a couple of really important issues tonight, in particular around patient consent, around privacy and data handling, considerations about reviewing the note and who owns the note at the end of the day. Is it the AI or is it the clinician? And then around a little bit around copy paste risk as well. So let's see if we can end that poll, maybe, Devon? No, it's not coming up for me, so apologies. I will see if... Oh, there we go. It should come up now. Is the results of that coming up for people? Here we go. It should be that... so we've got 55% of you using it regularly, and that's not surprising for an audience who's coming to a webinar around these tools, I guess. We've got some who have tried one, but there's a number of you who are not yet... used one but are interested, or you're unsure, which is fantastic to see a good spread, and that's what I probably would have expected as well. So let's start the discussion around the issue of consent. So obviously, when we use these tools, it's important to get a valid and appropriate consent. And I wonder if we can start with you, Owen, around your sort of thoughts about this. From a medico-legal perspective, what is required from a clinician in terms of getting consent? When is it required? And then we might go to Sean about how we might practically implement some of these in our practice.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Ray. And good to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Just before I do get started, as a lawyer, I just have to say a couple of words. First of all, anything I talk about in terms of medico-legal information, just to remind the audience, it's not intended to be legal advice. So if you do require specific advice, please get in touch with your own MDO or seek independent legal advice. Just the second thing, as I'm here representing MIPS. MIPS doesn't endorse any specific AI products, nor does it have any commercial relationships or agreements with any software vendors. So just to make that really clear and to disclose that from the beginning. But look, thanks. Consent is absolutely critical. It's probably one of the most important things for users or potential future users to consider. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So I think the first thing to bear in mind is just thinking about how an AI scribe works. There is a microphone in the consultation setting, and that microphone is recording what transpires during the consultation or the patient interaction. And so, although not yet tested by the courts here in Australia, what that means is that it's highly likely, in my view, that courts will consider an AI scribe to be a form of listening device. Each state and territory in Australia has different laws governing the use of listening devices, but essentially the definition of what a listening device is fairly similar. Essentially, it includes any instrument, apparatus, equipment, or device, and that can include software that's capable of being used to overhear, record, monitor, or listen to a conversation. And so there was a case about 10 years ago where a patient secretly recorded a consultation with a GP using a secreted pen audio device. And the court had no trouble in finding that the pen device was a listening device, and that by not letting the GP know, that was a criminal offence and a breach of the New South Wales Surveillance Devices Act. So I guess normally when we talk about consent, we talk about consent in terms of informed consent. So making sure that patients understand the nature of treatment that's being proposed, and that we talk about the benefits and the risks and give patients an opportunity to ask relevant questions. All of that still applies in relation to the use of an AI scribe in order to comply with obligations under the Privacy Act. But at its most basic, in order to I guess control for the risk of allegations that listening devices laws have been breached, what clinicians need to do is be very clear with patients that you intend to record the consultation, and to give patients the opportunity to opt out. And that's really critical. So I think of there being sort of like two consent on two different levels. At its most basic, there's simply letting patients know and other parties that are in the consultation room, letting people know what you intend to do, i.e. record the consultation, and giving people an opportunity to opt out. Much like if you're on hold at a call center and you get that, waiting music and the recorded message saying that your call may be recorded for quality and training purposes, please let us know if you don't consent to that. And that protects you against a breach of listening devices laws. And you need to do that prior to each and every consultation. And the reason I say that is because the law would regard any recording of a consultation without patient knowledge or consent as being a separate criminal offence. And so whilst in the future, when AI scribes are more ubiquitously used, we might be able to rely upon standing consent. I think at the moment, given AI scribes are still emerging and evolving technology, and B, we don't quite know how the law will handle these new technologies in terms of what standards they'll expect of practitioners. I think a very risk-averse approach is that at its most basic, prior to each consultation, you let patients know what you're intending to do and give them the opportunity to opt out. Prior to the first consultation, though, I think the consent process needs to be much more involved and to cover off things that are required under the Privacy Act. So letting patients know what information will be collected, i.e. is it identifiable or not? Where will it be stored, for how long, who has control of that information, and what will be the data flows. Very common question that we get asked is, for example, for GPs, can I get my receptionist to do the consent for me? All the law requires is that patients are informed. But again, I come back to the fact that given that a breach of surveillance devices laws is a criminal offence, I think it's important for clinicians to have control over that consent process to assure themselves that that's been undertaken. Other things like having privacy policies, letting patients know about the intended use of an AI scribe in the waiting room. There are other things that practices and practitioners can do to support the consent process as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Owen. So I think that that can seem a bit overwhelming for some people when they're first starting off using these tools. But it's very important that, as you said, there's legislation that really dictates some of these policies. I wonder, Sean, in your experience, having, as a practice owner and a GP who works in the space, what is it that you do to kind of practically implement and make sure that you're providing consent without overburdening the patient, perhaps during the consult, but also with too much information? How can you get that practically right?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. It's as Owen says, it's very different between a new patient or a patient you haven't used your AI scribe with before, and a patient who's been through a number of consults with an AI scribe. Practically, what I do, I say, oh look. If it's a new patient, I'll say, hi, welcome to the practice. In our practice, we use an AI scribe. It just listens, it's a little microphone that sits on the desk, just listens in the background. It's a secure connection between what we say and a server. The information is de-identified, and it's a server located in Australia, and the data is processed there and is sent back. It's encrypted between where we are and where the server is, and none of the information is used for training or goes external. And I think that covers off on the key points. Most of that goes over most patients' heads, to be honest. But if they have further queries, on our website, we have a page that talks about AI scribes and the consent for AI scribes. And most of us in our practice are using Lyrebird, and we direct them to and most of the AI scribes will have this. They'll have an patient information sheet on the more detailed deep dive into the privacy concerns that people may have. Then ongoing, I do it every time, but I do a much more truncated version. So by the time you're doing it your fourth or fifth time, it's pretty much, oh, do you mind if I just switch the AI scribe on again? And they're like, yep, okay. Or even what I do, we have a third party platform that gains a pre-consult questionnaire from our patients, and that includes an AI consent. So we can see that the patient has already consented, and then you don't even need to ask. They've already gone through that before the consultation. So just improves that workflow and workflow efficiency.
Yeah, that's great, Sean. Thank you for those practical tips. And I think it does sound like Owen was mentioning that really the important kind of target is to make sure that the patient's informed, and it could be probably done in a number of ways, pre-consult forms, and conversations with the patient. You could facilitate that through messaging around the waiting room. But in the end of the day, they need to be aware of it. They need to know what this means, and then they need to consent to it. So that's really helpful. You did touch a little bit, Sean, on the next issue I wanted to talk about, which is about the data handling considerations and also privacy. What is the significance, Owen, about the data being managed and kept onshore rather than being processed or stored offshore?
Yeah, look, good question. So the reason we think about it is because of the operation of various privacy laws in different jurisdictions. So again, just like surveillance devices laws, every state and territory operates under different privacy laws, but all of them have in common requirements for disclosure if health information or sensitive information, depending on the jurisdiction, it's worded slightly differently. But essentially, patients need to be aware, and you need to get consent from patients if health information about them is being transferred to an overseas jurisdiction. It's a little bit more complicated than that legally, like most things. If the data is being transferred to an overseas jurisdiction that has privacy protections that are similar to the privacy protections we have in place in Australia, and that could be either through the operation of the law in that jurisdiction, or there may be a contract or some contractual means of enforcing confidentiality. Then consent may not be required. But of course, the challenge is knowing what jurisdictions are comparable. And recent amendments to the Privacy Act will mean that subsequently the Attorney General will list what jurisdictions are regarded as comparable. I'm not aware yet that that's actually happened. And so it leaves the onus very much on the practitioner to understand that. And that's a difficult concept even for lawyers to know. So I think with an abundance of caution, what it means is for overseas data transfers, you essentially need to get additional consent from patients, which means that you as a user most importantly, need to know what happens to your patient's data when you're using an AI scribe. So you need to know what happens to that information so you can then inform patients accordingly. So it's not that it's unlawful to send patient data overseas, but you just need to get consent from patients beforehand. And it's just an added administrative burden doing that. So, if there's one less thing that you can get away with not having to do, then of course, having information stored on local servers reduces the need to have to inform and get consent from patients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can understand why that those rules are in place. I mean, if you're a patient, there better be a good reason why it's going overseas, and especially if it's in a jurisdiction that has different data handling requirements and privacy laws than Australia. And if that's the case, then there's got to be a good reason for that and explanation given. So, Sean, how do you handle this in practice? I mean, there are a number of scribes available, and they have different data processing rules, and there's a number of them, for example, based in the US that may have different rules and where things are stored because of where their priorities are. So I guess, how do you handle that? And then is there anything else that you can add to the discussion around like privacy and data handling? So what do you discuss with the patient when you discuss privacy here?
Depends on the tech knowledge of the patient, the questions that the patient asked. So I think the key things for a high-end patient who wants to know more of the background, the fact that it's encrypted between the recording on the microphone in your consult room and the server, in my case, the Lyrebird server in Melbourne, and then that there's two-factor authentication, that the data is de-identified when it leaves the local source, and then it comes back and is re-identified. I think that is very, very important. The fact that it's not used for training, the fact that I have my data, so there's a option within most of the scribes about deleting your data. I opt to delete my data at 4 days. I find that I haven't needed any transcript beyond 4 days. So letting them know that it's not stored indefinitely, that it's not used for training, that it doesn't go into, their data doesn't go into training other models, and I think is all very, very important.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. So I think we might move on to the idea of other risks associated with the clinical encounter. One of the things that I've certainly heard for busy clinics is the ease in which workflows break in general. I think we all know as clinicians that when we get into a sort of routine of clinical workflow, if there's something that changes, say use of an AI scribe, that can actually disrupt workflows a little bit in the first instance, but then the payoff can be quite substantial if used well. I wanted to talk about one particular risk, Owen, and that is around the copy pasting. So obviously a lot of scribes will work independent of the EMR, where you copy the output and then put it into the EMR. And certainly some of the feedback that I've had in terms of using that approach is that it can be easy to forget, or it can be easy to put into the wrong patient. Have you seen any examples of that? Maybe not specifically, but just and then what do you think about it in general? Is that risk a really meaningful risk? And then how would you combat that?
Yeah, again, I think excellent question. I think the copy paste risk for me is part of a broader category of medico-legal risk, which is around the accuracy of the output. And there are a number of ways in which the output may not be accurate. So it may be that the microphone mishears something during the transcription. It may be that during the processing of the output, the algorithm hallucinates, or it may be that you cut and paste the wrong transcript into the wrong patient file. Either way, whichever happens, the output is essentially incorrect. And I think for me, inaccurate outputs are probably the biggest concern that I have from a medico-legal perspective in relation to AI scribes. Not that I think it's insurmountable, and I should point out, there are many medico-legal issues to consider with the use of AI scribes, none of which I think are reasons not to use them. I just think it's a case of being forewarned, and therefore forearmed about what these issues are and how best to combat them. I think the biggest concern that I have from a legal perspective is, you could generate an entire record using an AI scribe, and it might comprise 20, 30, 40 individual patient interactions, and you fastidiously check the accuracy of all of the outputs except for one. And if that one output is then relevant in later legal proceedings, the fact that that output is inaccurate and maybe clearly inaccurate to a court or to lawyers that may be assessing and reviewing those records, what it does is it unfortunately casts a shadow over the reliability of the entire record. So, I mean, it's a very legal, specific sort of concern that I have. I think consent is easy to overcome. It's just about having conversations with patients. Privacy is technical, but as Sean mentioned, I think most of the major players have good resources available to help support users understand what happens to patient information and how to have those conversations with patients. But I think when we're busy, it's very easy to be interrupted, to forget to check the output to check the accuracy of an AI generated output, and very easy to cut and paste into the wrong patient file. That can happen even if you create records manually without using AI. But I think, given how long a transcript can be and how much information may be in there, I think that raises some particular concerns. A, the output isn't accurate in relation to that patient, but B, if the output is identifiable or referable to another individual, then that may also be a privacy breach. So Sean may have some ideas about workflows in order to try and mitigate that risk. But I think from a legal perspective, checking and double checking the accuracy of each and every output is absolutely critical. There must be a human in the loop. It's an obligation under the Medical Board of Australia's Code of Conduct that records generated are accurate, and the responsibility for checking the accuracy of the output ultimately rests with the clinician, both from a legal, professional and ethical perspective.
Yeah, fantastic, Owen. Thank you. I mean, we will come on to the idea of reviewing the note and how important that is, and then I'll be definitely picking Sean's brains about how we can kind of protocolize that in practices, because the importance of not sort of becoming completely reliant on the scribe and not allowing that to, and the fact that it's so useful, not relying on that alone and having that kind of human in the loop that you talked about. So important. I agree, Owen. But before we do that, I think just to come back to this idea of wrong file, which is one part of this risk, I guess. Sean, you've used a number of scribes, and of course, there is this integration component where we've got some scribes that are integrated and others that are not. How have you found that practically change things in your workflow? And then we might move on to this kind of overarching concept of reviewing the note and how we can protocolize that.
Yeah, look, integration, I think, is absolutely it's such a boon. It saves so much time, saving just a couple of clicks or having to type the name into a web browser or whatever. So from a time perspective, it probably saves 20 to 30 seconds per consult, which over the course of a week adds up to quite a lot. Additionally, you almost completely mitigate the risk of, well, you mitigate completely the risk of transcribing into the wrong patient file. you open the patient file, and if you can, in your PMS, and if you can click on a button that integrates directly with your scribe, then you know that the note's going back to the correct file. The other thing is most the scribes that do integrate will make sure that you don't close the patient file without putting a note in, because the window's still sitting open, and that's probably the biggest risk, is that you have a clinical encounter, because then that's not just a medico-legal risk, it's a Medicare compliance risk. And then you bill a care plan, and then you come back and there's nothing there. You haven't got a leg to stand on. So I think that integration is really key and serves a number of pretty major benefits.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yeah, so just going to this wider concept of reviewing the note, the importance of it, and we as senior clinicians need to also be ensuring that our junior staff are sort of understanding this, and we take responsibility when we are teaching our junior staff how to take a patient history, and in the same way, and then document it in the same way. We need to also be teaching them, if they're going to be using AI scribes, to do the same thing in the appropriate way. Interested, Sean, in your sort of approach. You heard Owen's kind of thoughts about how sort of there's the break in the workflow can happen. People can get reliant on it. How can we, in practice, get people and our colleagues to kind of incorporate this as a routine part of their workflow? That is, reviewing the note and maybe reviewing key parts of the note that are perhaps the most, well, let's not say the most important, but the key things that might be that you might want to focus on to a high degree.
Yeah. Look, I think there's a couple of key bits. I mean, you should review every bit of every note. Now, does everyone do that all the time? I'm sure they don't. So you need to really look at what are the ones that are going to make the key difference, and what are the ones most often the scribe gets wrong. So the key ones, so I think drugs and drug doses, you really need to check every single time. And names of drugs, you need to check every single time. Your plan, so what are you advising the patient to do? That's the bit that it can get wrong. And scribes will sometimes, if you say don't do blah 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 blah, if they don't hear the don't do correctly, the scribe can transcribe it such that you've told the patient to do something you've said not to do. So those very important positives or negatives are important to look in your output and make sure that they have been covered off correctly. The other thing, just from a practical perspective, if you're finding that the scribe is getting a particular word, or say a specialist name or a drug name wrong repeatedly, go in and change it within. Don't paste it into your PMS notes and then change it. Change it within the scribe. Most of the scribes will learn from changes that you make, and you've got the option to change once or change forever. And if it's forever making the wrong mistake, then if you change it once, it will prevent it. It will speed up your future consults.
Great, thank you, Sean. Yeah, I think that the other consideration is around what you mentioned. Where's the error happening? AI in general, we know, has a rate of hallucinations. There is going to be some rate of that. Now, at Lyrebird, we look to have a protocol and a process in order to test that rate and then drive it lower. And I think that should be part of every process in companies that use this software or use this technology. I guess the question is, if you were to use a transcription software and just dictate it and then send it off to a human who types it, what would you be doing? Would you just accept the note, or would you look and check that some of the key information is done correctly? And I think that kind of broad mental model is a nice one, and it's a simple one that you can say to junior staff, especially who might be wondering how I should be thinking about these. It can improve time saving so considerably, but to ensure accuracy, you're the one who owns the record, and you should be checking it in an appropriate way.
And I think the other thing to say is the quality has just improved out of sight.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been using these for about 3 years now. And when I started, I had to correct every output in multiple places. Now it's one or two every second or third consult, if that. Yeah, I think that the quality is really ramping up.
Fantastic. So for the people who are wanting to ask some questions, there is the Q&A open, so please feel free to continue to use that. There's been some questions in here. Very interested to pick Owen and Sean's brains around this. There's a couple of interesting questions, Sean, about the template and whether this works in various populations, and just in terms of consent. Are you finding that it's a challenge in certain populations, for example, in the elderly, to explain the concept of AI scribes? So there's one question, I think, from someone in the chat around people over 70 or 75, and how do I explain that? It might take more time than I save in an AI scribe to explain it to them. What would you say in that kind of situation? How would you overcome that barrier?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Um, that cohort of patients are actually very accepting. They put a lot of trust in their doctors and in if you are vouching for something, they tend to, usually you've been their GP for a long period of time, and they will trust what you say. So I don't usually go overly technical with them. I just say, look, it's a microphone. It listens to our conversation. It then uses an AI computer system in Australia to turn it into words, and it saves me time. And it means I can spend time with you and pay more attention to what you're saying. And they most of them seem pretty happy with that. I don't talk about two-factor authentication and encryption and large language models or anything like that. And but I also leave the door open and say, look, do you have any more questions, or do you have any concerns, or do you want any more information about it? And usually they're like, no, that's fine. If you want to use it, I trust you. That's been my uniform response from that cohort. The 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 I still have a number of patients who don't want me to use an AI scribe, and most of them are younger and just a little bit more suspicious of the system. It would literally be two or three patients, and with them, I just have to type my notes, and I find it extremely frustrating, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, I think that you can think about it in terms of how you might explain, and although it's different, how you might explain the use of a medical record, electronic medical record to a patient. You're going to explain a sort of technology in general in a different way to different groups of people. That's part of our role as really good communicators. But the most important thing is that at the end of the day, they feel comfortable that they've made their consent independently. And I think Sean's sort of said that really nicely. There's a number of questions in the Q&A around the consent process and how we can, make it easier. We actually do have at Lyrebird a consent pack and a bit of a further discussion around consent. So feel free to pop there, just because there was maybe 7 or 8 questions on that same thing. So I popped it into the chat. There's an interesting question by Dilip here, Owen, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts about people without capacity in a residential aged care service. I don't know if you've read that in the chat, but basically it's around whether they're a facility which has a kind of blanket consent form for a lot of things, and whether that would be appropriate as well in an AI scribe tool if that was to be used in that setting.
Yeah, I think again, for the same reason that I would urge caution with delegating the consent process, at least the initial consent process to, reception staff, where you may lose control of what information is disclosed to patients or their caregivers or substitute decision makers. And given that with the use of an AI scribe, we're potentially dealing with criminal offences if you breach listening devices laws by not getting proper consent. I think, again, I think the risk-averse approach would be to get specific consent in relation to the use of an AI scribe. So yes, there may be standing consent to treatment, but I think in relation to an AI scribe, and this is where I think, I'm the first to concede that it may make it more challenging to use an AI scribe in an aged care setting, because you may have to get consent each time you use an AI scribe, and the consent that you obtain may not be from the individual whose consultation is being recorded. I do think, though, that the risk-averse approach is to get consent from the substitute decision maker prior to each consultation. And like I said, it may just simply be, I'm reviewing your mother today. I'm going to be using an AI scribe. Is that okay with you? Like I said, I totally understand that from a practical perspective, that may seem excessive. But I just reiterate what I said before. This is new technology. We don't know how the courts will deal with it. And given that we're dealing with potentially criminal offences, if we don't get it right, then I think I'd urge an abundance of caution.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Owen. A question just in general, Sean, around the documentation of consent. Just in general, how would you incorporate that consent into your documentation, into your EMR, into your note?
Yeah, so I don't get a patient to sign a consent form. I get verbal consent, but then I document it in the medical record. If patients are completing a pre-consult form, and then it comes through, that gets copied and pasted into the notes that they have consented. So that's in there as well.
Yeah, great. There was a question around data and how long is it stored for, and of course there's sort of the transcription concept, and there's the audio as well, right? And so most AI scribes will have an ability to set that, but it's important for you to look into that and make sure that that's what you're comfortable with. I think, Sean, you mentioned that you sort of set it at around the 4-day mark, but I guess the question that has been asked in the Q&A is there an ability to choose how long it's stored for, or do you have to kind of sit there and remember to manually delete it? So I guess that's a question for you.
Yeah, no, there is the option. I can only speak for Lyrebird, but within Lyrebird, there is the option to tailor how long you retain your record for. So 1 day, 2 days, 4 days, a week. I think the maximum is 6 months, so it won't be retained beyond 6 months. But really, I haven't found the need to, other than say, you have a power outage and the thing goes down and you have to access it later, or some technical issue. I haven't found the need to go back, and even then you're going back usually within 24 hours, but I keep it for 4 days just to be safe. And I think the longer you leave the data, the greater risk you're exposing everyone to. So that you look at the big companies with data breaches, and they were they were criticised for their data retention policies.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It's interesting, isn't it? Oh, and I think you mentioned and touched on this, and there's a comment by Safe in the chat here around how this is the kind of situation at the moment, but it may well be completely different in 6 to 12 months' time. Maybe we've got a bit more of a unified policy or governance structure around this in terms from government or the regulator. And so it may be that at that time, when we do rediscuss this in 6 or 12 months' time, that we have a lot more direction around it, because there is some areas that seem a bit maybe unclear or in a grey zone. And so, although it is important and really useful to get your perspective here around that, maybe it's going to be a little bit tightened up in the next few months. So, what's your sort of thoughts about that? And I guess probably from your point of view, you'd probably prefer that.
Yeah, well, I think everyone would if we
Yeah.
knew where the goalposts were and there was greater clarity over what the expectations were. I think that that helps everyone, helps lawyers, helps clinicians, most importantly. I have a few thoughts. I mean, I guess at the moment, well, there's a number of regulators that are interested in AI. I guess the Therapeutic Goods Administration is responsible for regulating medical devices. At the moment, AI scribes, when used as AI scribes, are not considered medical devices. That's different in other jurisdictions. The TGA is reviewing that at the moment. It's hard to know where that will end up, whether there will be any changes in relation to AI scribes. Um, I guess the other thing to think about as well is the attitude of our medical regulators. So, the Medical Board of Australia and AHPRA have released guidance in relation to the use of AI and AI scribes, and a number of colleges have as well. Um, uh, and I mean, at the moment, they are still relatively generic documents that don't necessarily go into all of the specifics, but certainly from the medical board's perspective, consent, transparency, trust, um, uh, uh, and avoidance of bias and discrimination are important sort of guiding pillars in their documents. I guess, though, from a sort of practical on the ground perspective, we are starting to see practitioners who are being perhaps audited by the medical regulators, maybe in relation to their practice or in relation to their records. And certainly, we have seen a couple of cases now where for example, practitioners going through performance assessments where performance assessors are recommending that practitioners may consider using an AI scribe to assist with their note taking. So, although not necessarily the official line of the regulators, certainly the processes that the regulators administer, namely performance assessments for some practitioners, it is something that's starting to enter into the conversation. So, it's very difficult to know where it's going to end up, but I think it's likely to become the norm. And then, of course, that starts to raise, other questions around, I guess, the professional responsibility perhaps of practitioners that aren't using AI scribes or other tools in the future. Hard to know where it's going to end up, though.
If I can just add to that too, our practice went through accreditation last year, and yeah, we got glowing feedback because almost everybody now in one of our two practices uses an AI scribe, and we got glowing feedback on the quality of the notes. And that was just a straight tick, so that made that bit of the accreditation significantly easier.
Yeah, that's really interesting perspective there, Owen, and Sean's hearing that. We've heard that from a number of different practice owners where the importance from a AGPAL kind of accreditation and audit point of view is really that they can be comfortable that the notes are consistently high standard.
And
And yeah,
actually,
go ahead,
sorry,
Sean. Yeah.
the other thing I just remembered too, I can give you a sneak peek or preview. There's an article that's coming out that on the quality of notes that GPs write versus AI scribes in the AJGP, and we did a study, and it was back in 2024. So it's in AI terms, that's forever ago, and the quality. Assessed blind was proven to be superior for all of the scribes compared to experienced GPs. So Yeah. Sorry to interrupt there, Ray.
No, no, that's so interesting, Sean. I mean, I guess what that shows is the potential, if harnessed right, and I think we could all three of us agree on that. The potential to, if harnessed right, to this for this to be not only an improvement in the patient-doctor interaction, the documentation, the improvement to the doctor's ability to get home on time. All of these things can work really well if used correctly. And I think that's what this webinar hopefully has provided some insight into. There's a couple more questions that we might just finish up with. We're getting to almost time here. And I wanted to sort of ask a broader question for you to both finish on, but there's a question around AI recordings and whether they can be subpoenaed. So Sean mentioned earlier, Owen, that most of the time transcripts, you can set your kind of expiry date. The same thing happens with recordings, which are generally just destroyed at a certain point. I wonder what your thoughts are if there was a practitioner out there using an AI scribe that just left it up there, had the recordings that were just there, and it was 2 years later, not Lyrebird, but let's say there was one. What would happen? Would that potentially be subpoenaed?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think the issue of retention from a legal perspective is a little bit more complicated. In terms of your legal obligations when it comes to retention of information, it very much depends on, first of all, what jurisdiction in Australia you're in, because requirements are very different. Secondly, whether or not the information stored is identifiable or not. So whether or not it can be referenced back to a patient. And then I think the third thing is whether there's any information in the transcript that isn't in the output, and whether that would be considered health information if it's identifiable. So I don't want to get into the complexities of that, but from a legal perspective, there's a little bit more to unpack that perhaps we don't have time to unpack tonight. The question, though, in relation to subpoenas. So, I mean, to answer the opposite first, if the transcript doesn't exist, then you can't subpoena it, and you're not going to get into trouble by anyone for the absence of that information from the court that's requested that. So you can only subpoena what exists, because that's a common question that we get asked. But if the transcript still exists, it depends very much on what documents you're being asked to produce in the subpoena. So if the subpoena is for the entire medical record, well, then I guess that's a question about where that transcript sits. Would you consider that there's essentially two records, the EMR and, I don't know, any information left over within the cloud-based server? Again, is that information referable to a patient? Can you retrieve it and know that it belongs to a particular patient? May depend on the product that you're using, may depend on what is in that information. So I think if it's identifiable and it can be referable to a particular patient, it may, if the wording of the subpoena is to produce the entire record. If the subpoena is to produce all health information, then that's broader, because that would include what's in the EMR, what may be hanging around on the cloud-based server that might include transcripts, but that might also include emails and text messages and photographs on your phone that I'm probably not advised to do. But if you've shared clinical images with a colleague, for example, and they're on a device, like, all of that is health information. So I think it very much depends on the wording of the subpoena. But I think that's a sort of technical question that people should get advice on if or when that ever occurs.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Owen. One other specific question from the audience, and then we'll get into some closing remarks. So the question from an anonymous person here in the Q&A was around the use of recordings to train models on clinical reasoning and decision making. At Lyrebird, we have a position on that, which is not to use any clinical information in recordings to train our models. But I guess the question is, this is a potential thing that some AI companies, or say keep it general, might do. So, Sean, I mean, I guess, Sean, you probably one of the first things that you might look into as a clinician is whether that's the case. Is that correct? And then, Owen, I'd love to your understanding about where that is in terms of your, the medical legal risk there.
Yeah, so I guess the questions around, could the AI could the transcript be used to replace GPs in 5 years' time? Look, that I did a bit of a deep dive into it. It's not used for training. It's not used to about the clinical reasoning. It's not used to create a virtual GP. So I am comfortable that's not happening. Now, I haven't dug into all of the companies. I think just from, and this is purely anecdotal, but just chatting with other people in the digital health space, things like ChatGPT Health or Claude Health, I think they're using that a lot more and using those interactions a lot more, and they're using doctors at the back end of that to help train up their algorithms to be able to do that. But I don't see it happening with Australian GP interactions.
Thanks for that, Sean. And Owen, any thoughts on that sort of concept of models being trained? As Sean said, a lot of providers, sort of more consumer-based providers, let's say, are sort of coming into the health space, and maybe there's a risk of that as well.
Mm. Yeah, I think for me it comes back to uh, your due diligence before you start using a product. So you need to understand what happens to patient information, as Sean's already talked about, what information is stored, where, for how long, and for what uses, for what purposes. Um, so privacy laws in Australia are very clear that you can use health information without patient consent if it's consistent with the primary purpose for which it was collected. So, in other words, you can use patient information for the provision of healthcare because you've collected that information for the provision of healthcare. So, that's why you can collect it, put it in your record, and then write a referral letter. You don't have to get specific consent from patients before you write a referral letter to a named specialist. Um, However, for training purposes, if patient information is being used to train the AI model, the AI algorithm, that's a secondary purpose that isn't related, at least not directly related, to the primary purpose for which the information was collected in the first place. So for that, you would need to get consent. But of course, you can only get consent from patients to do that if you know that it's actually happening. So you do need to ask those questions. The other, I guess, sort of important point to consider when answering that question is, of course, if the information is all redacted of identifying information, then it's actually not considered health information under privacy laws. And that's where I think it gets a little bit tricky, because while it may not be unlawful to use de-identified patient information, which is then not health information, for secondary purposes that are not directly related to the provision of healthcare. Of course, the broader question is, what would patients think if they knew that that was happening, and what does that mean for patients and the public's trust in these models? And I do think trust is really important. We've talked a lot about the law. I've talked a lot about the law, and what regulators require, and what different statutes require. But at the end of the day, I think as well, it's important to recognise that given it's new technology, trust plays a very important role here as well. It only takes, one or two high-profile cases where things go wrong, and that can, very quickly evaporate public trust in these tools.
I couldn't have said that better myself, Owen. I completely agree. I think in healthcare, trust is everything, and that I think is the foundation of how we work. I wonder if I could ask you a last closing question, the same question to each of you, and then we'll finish up. This has been a fantastic webinar, and I hope people have got a lot out of it. I think there's been some fantastic engagement, lots of questions showing that there is a sort of thirst for this out there, and it's great to see so many people turn up on a weekday evening. Yeah, I mean, the sort of final question I had for both of you. So I might go to you, Sean, first. So if you've got a GP who comes to you, and I'm sure you have this all the time, given your role in RACGP and also in digital health, they're kind of they're curious about the AI documentation, but they're pretty cautious about it. They're maybe not one of the early adopters, but the sort of cautious majority. What would you say is one of your first bits of advice before trying out this tool?
I'd say do your due diligence. So check out the tool that you're thinking of using, and just make sure that they treat the data respectfully, that it's properly looked after. I would advocate for being housed in Australia, and I think once you've done that, give it a go. Like honestly, the number of people who I've said give it a go and they're resistant, and I don't have to learn a new thing, and then they come back to me like 2 weeks later and go, "Oh, I wish I'd done that like months ago." It is just the amount of cognitive and mental load that it lifts, and it means you can focus on the patient. I think that's really one of the key benefits of this technology. You can actually engage more and more deeply with your patients. And it'd be really interesting. Another thing we're looking at doing a study on patient experience with an AI scribe consult versus not. Anecdotally, I believe quite strongly that you have a better patient experience when you use a scribe.
That's great advice. Thanks, Sean. And Owen, so same question to you. Someone's curious about this AI documentation, a bit cautious. What would be your bit of advice around this?
Yeah, good question. And thanks for asking me second. It gave me a little bit of thinking time. So without repeating everything that Sean said, but about which I wholeheartedly concur, I think the best way for me to think about it, particularly when I'm advising clinicians, is treat an AI scribe like a medical student. So if you're going to get a medical student to write your notes in a consultation, you need to get consent from the patient beforehand for the medical student to be there. And I think before you finalize the record of the consultation, you'd check what the medical student has written before you sign off on it as being an accurate representation of what occurred. So I don't know whether that's helpful or not, but that's kind of the simplified advice that I often give. I think a couple of other things. You need to understand how patient information will be used and treated by the scribe. So as we've talked about, where does the data go? Where's it stored? For how long? In what form? If you don't know the answers to those questions, then you can't advise patients and you can't therefore get their consent. And I think the last thing I would say is use your MDO. So at MIPS, we've got a whole heap of medico-legal resources on AI. We've got an advisory service. Other MDOs have similar resources. So use your MDO if you have any questions or concerns. That's what we're here for.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Owen and Sean, for joining me this evening. Look, I think overall this evening has shown that AI tools really do have a potential, and real life implementation shows that it can meaningfully reduce administrative burden in general practice. But the adoption really does depend on not just the technical capability here, but on trust. I think what Owen said earlier really resonates with me. The trust in the accuracy of the tool and the privacy protections around patient data, the trust in the medical legal framework, and the trust essentially in the company that you end up using. So I think hopefully you all gained a lot from this. The recording, there's been a lot of questions about the recording. It will be made available to you. And it's been wonderful to see so many of you come along tonight. And I just want to again thank Dr. Owen Bradfield, Dr. Sean Stevens for coming on to this evening and providing such great insights. Thank you, both of you.
Thanks, Ray. Been a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Ray. Thank you.
Bye.